Hi, this is a lecture on life course theory from your book, Wright, Tibbetts, and Daigle. So when we start looking at what life course theory is, it really is one of those theories that really kind of combines different disciplines. And, this has been based on a long series of research and theories that have been developed. And then we started to see that things overlapped, or what we called as a psychological theory. When we referred to it in sociology, it would be named something different, but they had the same similar components. So life course really kind of combines biological, sociological, psychological fields in coming up with understanding behavior over the life course. So what is the definition of life course? According to Elder in 1985, life course is the interconnection of trajectories that are influenced by societal changes and short-term developmental transitions. So when we look at life course, it's looking at behavior over different developmental periods. So it depends on what the source is and how they divide the developmental periods. Many times you will see that it'll be neonatal and perinatal, and then it'll be newborn. It could be newborn toddler, and then we have childhood. We might have adolescence and adulthood. Depending on your source will depend on how many developmental stages there are. So what this means is what kind of behaviors tend to be going through the different stages. They might appear differently, but the base is still the same. And we call these pathways trajectories. They are linked, behavior links over one development period to the next. Now, one of the things that we find is what are called life events. Life events are things that occur in one's life that might be very important. And we refer to these as transitions. And sometimes these transitions don't affect the trajectory or the pathway that one's on. But sometimes significant life events, such as the death of a parent, can really alter the trajectories, and these are called turning points. And so any turning point could be a positive or a negative in somebody's life. So when we look, if we map somebody's life out, a turning point of losing a parent could be a negative factor, but maybe family members stepped in, like uncles and other siblings that stepped up to help ease the role of the missing parent, where in someone's life it might not be a big thing. But in other people's lives, losing a parent might be a negative trajectory because mom still has to work, she's out of the house, and leaves you unsupervised. So these turning points can result from swift changes or gradual modifications to the life course. So some turning points might, like a death, might all of a sudden tumble someone down, where maybe moving and going to different schools might not result in those changes. It might be gradual over time. There are two general principles we find with the life course theory. The first is the potential effect that any life event is determined by its relation to other events and the timing in the life course. And when we look at our own lives, that certain events might be more traumatic at certain positions in our life than they are in others. So death of a parent in adulthood might not have the same trajectory effect as death of a parent when someone's a child, even as death of a parent when one is an infant might not have the same effect as death as a teenager. So it's all about the timing in the life course and how it relates to other events. The second part is the meaning and consequence of an event for an individual is related to the prevailing social context and the life history of that particular person. And what this ultimately means that each individual is an individual and how they perceive a life event can be different. So that's why we might see, let's say, a death of a parent in a family that has several children, and some might be affected differently than others. In other words, when we're looking at life course, similar events might occur at different social time periods based on age, and they might lead to different consequences. So some of the concepts and issues within life course are what they refer to as states, which really reflect your behavior and emotions, and they can be brought on by situational factors, and it might fluctuate. So one day you might be angry, something happens, the next day you're not. In other words, the state of your behavior or emotions can change. Some days you're grouchy, some days you're happy. It is what we call traits, though, are more persistent over a person's lifetime. And that includes our temperament. Are we fussy? Are we hard to get along with? Are we resistant? Do we not like change? And then that is combined with personality traits. Some personality traits, such as shyness, may be something that we see that might change a bit over the life course, but we still think that the person may be reserved as an adult, where we might call them shy as a child. And so one of the things with traits is that they're not that changing in one's life. They might just, you might act differently based on maturity level. But usually our temperament and our personality kind of we're stuck with them. So one of the things they refer to is state dependence. And this is really, once in a while, our behavior and emotions, they get out of hand. But normally our behavior and emotions pretty much kind of follow a pattern. We might be easily frustrated, so we get emotional. And the best way to predict this is what's referred to as state dependence. And that's past behavior really is one way to look at how future behavior will be influenced. So this is a table from your book just to show what we're talking about, developmental stages. And the book uses 3 different stages. And so we look at poor CNS development in infancy, which is your central nervous system. And as you read into the next section on right, he'll talk about how the central nervous system is connected with various brain activities. And ultimately, poor CNS development can lead to fussy and irritable babies. And a lot of times these might be premature babies that then contributes to the poor CNS development. We might find that these babies are difficult to soothe. In other words, they're not happy babies. And the bad part is that particularly if you don't have good parenting skills, it might be difficult to deal with these babies. So just think for a minute about a child that cries a lot. Maybe the child is a newborn who was born early, has colic, also has reflux, and cries all the time, and then doesn't sleep on top of it. So this difficulty to soothe ultimately probably makes the parents less able to handle them, makes them tireder and more frustrated. And so what it does is, in many cases, if parents aren't aware of how to deal with this type of behavior, there's less parental bonding. For example, I had worked with drug addicted newborns, and one of the things that we stressed was a lot of times the babies met this, but they didn't like to be touched because the drugs really inflamed their nerve endings. And so a mom would pick the baby up, the baby would scream, the mommy put the baby down, baby wouldn't scream. Pick it up, scream. This keeps repeating itself, and mom doesn't think the baby likes her. And so, because the baby doesn't like her, then the baby wants to be in its crib by itself. And so, a lot of times when dealing with the drug addicted newborns, we would find moms would just put the baby in the back room and let it cry, and they would ignore this behavior. Well, ultimately, what it's affecting is the ability to bond with that child. And we know as a child, the less they bond with the parents and have that safety mechanism there, the more likely that these behaviors are then going to continue. So in the book, they look at childhood, and so they see this fussy, irritable baby becomes a little hyperactive. And one of the problems with hyperactivity is sometimes kids are bouncing off the walls, and adults, how they respond to them, particularly, let's say, in daycare or in kindergarten, a lot of times it sets up peer rejection because the peers don't want to be talked to the same way, or the teacher might reprimand the child and the peers don't want to be in trouble. And so they steer away from this behavior, particularly if the hyperactivity is more aggressive, with kids grabbing things and maybe biting or pushing. We also find that a lot of these behaviors then lead to poor verbal scores, which is language and reading problems. But think about if the parent has not bonded with the child in the same way, and the child doesn't feel safe, a lot of times then the parent stops really talking to them. And if you go back to learning about predictors, one of the things that we see is this language development, and we find that ineffective parents don't really spend too much time with their kids. So if you have language and reading problems, one of the solutions would be to spend a lot of time reading to your child and working with that. But ineffective parents then don't do that. So it just puts the child behind. We see that physical aggression, more antisocial conduct disorder behavior, and lying. So then as the child moves to adolescence, we might see this now that they have less impulse control. So they act out, they burst out in class, shout out answers. They might have trouble because language and reading problems are critical. You have to be able to read and understand in order to be successful in school. So if those problems are not addressed, then we see school failure. It also then results in poor relationships. You know, most kids gravitate towards somebody that's like them. And if somebody is lying, no one wants to have friends that lie to them, or physically aggressive. It's going to be a hard time making friendships. So one of the things that they might be attracted to are peers that are like them. And a lot of times they have this aggressive bias and deviant bias. So this is just an example of stability and change over time, and how behaviors that start out once can then be reflected. So one of the things, and it's not in your book, that they look at that is connected with antisocial behavior are what they call MPAs, or minor physical anomalies. And these are minor things that are disformities that really don't influence anything as far as you still can hear or you can still see, but they are noticeable enough that the research has shown the more physical anomalies have, the more likely you are to be antisocial. So we look at some of these like confluent eyebrows, like you might have a furrowed tongue that kind of curves. There might be only one crease on your hand. Everybody look, is your fifth finger curved? You can take off your shoes. Is your third toe longer than the second toe? And like really electric fine hair. Abnormal head size can be either large or small. For example, my head size is one standard deviation below norm. My husband's head size is probably two standard deviations above norm. And then we have one child who has a head size that's three standard deviations below norm. And in other words, his head in comparison to other heads is smaller. Now, as he's grown and as an adult and even as a child, this wasn't something that somebody would pick up on other than the doctor picked up on it. But after doing MRIs when he was, I think he was like 1 year old, they found out that even though he had a smaller head size, that the brain structure was fine. There was a concern that if the head is too small, then it can lead to as the brain grows, starting to push on the skull. Width of mouth, somebody that has an extremely wide mouth versus someone might have an extremely small mouth. Eye abnormalities, it could be the shape of the eyes or the slant of the eyes. A prominent forehead that kind of sticks out and protrudes, just like ear protrusion. Low-seated ears would be ears that are lower than normal. Or there might be malformed ears, again with my son with a small head. His one ear, he can't get an earbud into it. He can hear fine from it, but the hole is smaller than the other one. So abnormal nails, like somebody might have bumpy nails. And then here's another thing you can take off your shoe to check. Do you have a large gap between your first and second toe? There's a whole list of them. I just put some that you might be concerned with. But all these, the more you have, might be an indication of antisocial behavior. So here is a table of neonatal development. And it's interesting that most birth defects happen within the first 8 weeks of human development. And yet most women don't know they're pregnant during those defects. And you'll read about these more in your Right book, that ultimately some start 11 days after conception. What it really does point to is how important it is for the environment of a fetus to grow up in. And then when we add in different things, whether it be like nutrition, drug use, alcohol use, all these things are going to affect the development and affect that growing CNS system, affect the brain development. So brains really start developing, look in the third week. The CNS system is now starting. And the first thing that is being formed is the heart. So think about that. This is 3 weeks. And again, most people don't even know they're pregnant at 3 weeks. And so behaviors that you might be doing could be damaging these. Okay. So 3 concepts of life course. Our early antisocial behavior is a link to adult deviant behavior across a variety of settings. In other words, what we notice is antisocial behavior is not just linked to what do you do at home, but we're going to find it in all facets of life. So if we see antisocial behavior in a youth, that it's going to be across a variety of settings. Now, think about your mom might have said, you were a hellion when you were at home, but your teachers thought you were an angel. So your behavior was changing based on the location. And usually kids act the worst at home. So, but if you were acting bad in the home life and in school, and then let's say in church, we're seeing that continuity over the different developmental periods, but also in a variety of settings. Second, delinquency has an effect on adult social bonds. So early on, if a child displays delinquent behavior, a lot of times they're not going to be committed to pro-social learning. They might be having trouble with that. They might not be dedicated to, for example, getting income the correct way. Instead of getting like a part-time job, they decide to steal it. Their commitment to a job is usually scanty, particularly if they've found other behaviors. And even if they get a job, a lot of times these behaviors will continue. For example, they get a job and they steal food or they steal money. And so they don't last very long at jobs. And ultimately, this is going to affect social bonds because you're developing bad habits. And then it's really going to be, if you have an antisocial person, the chances of them really impressing a pro-social person are minimal. Occasionally it happens, but it ultimately probably is going to limit who's going to be attracted to you. Finally, these outcomes occur independently of variables. So antisocial behavior is not based on class or ethnicity, IQ, or even family and school factors. Ultimately, these behaviors may be influenced by them, but they're not independent of them. So antisocial behavior, a lot of times you hear this referred to as conduct disorder or oppositional disorder when children are younger. We don't really call it antisocial behavior until they're 18. Really comes down to early aggressive behavior. And this is the largest risk factor that has been researched. And we find that early, overly aggressive behavior continues over the developmental periods and usually means that they're going to be aggressive as adults. Youth who show antisocial behavior across settings, as in the last one, like homeschool, neighborhood, church, are more likely to continue that antisocial behavior as they get older. There are a variety of antisocial acts that the kid can participate in. Think about some of the characteristics of antisocial behavior, and I'll show those in a minute. But let's say lying, or stealing, or being aggressive. These antisocial behaviors result in antisocial acts. So I might steal money out of the teacher's purse, or I might be very aggressive on the playground. And when people talk to me, I lie to them about everything. I lie about things that I might have at home that I don't have. And as people start to discover, one, that they lie about things or their behavior keeps increasing, we, one, know that those antisocial acts then will increase the risk of future acts. So the more antisocial acts you do as a young child that aren't addressed, then the more likely they are to continue during the life course. And then we see a lot from Moffat's work. Moffat really distinguished two types of antisocial behavior. One that we would call early onset antisocial behavior that is more likely to continue over the life course. And the other is situational antisocial behavior that really happens when kids are in their teenage years. You know, they kind of rebel against their parents. They think that they're adults. They're denied some of the things that adults do. Like, for example, you're not allowed to drink. You might not be able to get a full-time job. You still have to go to school. And these things might ultimately affect how the kid sees his life at that particular time and might participate in some what we would call antisocial behavior or deviant behavior. For example, trying alcohol or maybe experimenting with drugs or arguing with their parents. But as they mature into becoming closer to 18, these behaviors go away. So one of the things that the book talks about are homotypic and heterotypic behavior over developmental stages. And homotypic behavior is similar behavior. And so that would be something that we would look for, particularly in antisocial behavior. Does the behavior or some type of similar behavior keep occurring in each stage? So a child might start out biting and then, be in kindergarten and kicking people. And then as they get older, then punching people. And so the behavior, the aggressive behavior is still there. It's just changing how we see it in each stage. Heterotypic are behaviors that are different over time. And this might be also a good example of, again, some of the behaviors that we might see. So I think that my punch kick and biting would be similar behaviors because they're all aggressive. They have down here punch kick, but let's use like stealing. They might steal minor things when they're little, like they might steal candy or they might steal money from mom's purse. And then as they get bigger, they might steal, shoplift from a store. And then they might move on to car theft or burglary. So we see that it increases over time. So here is a list of characteristics of antisocial behavior. Impulsivity, which is all prefrontal cortex, the last to form, forms up, but now they're showing up to the age of 25, possibly 26. But that prefrontal cortex is really your brake system. And so impulsivity a lot of times is located there. And so if your brain's not maturing as quickly as others, we might see that impulsive behavior. Aggressiveness, again, aggressiveness that is above and beyond what maybe toddlers of the same age are doing. Irritability, difficult to get along with. We always called people that we knew that were like this high maintenance because you never knew what would set them off. You'd be having a conversation and all of a sudden they get mad about something. So it's hard to predict when they're going to be irritable and when they're not. One of the things that we might see are risk-taking behaviors, doing activities that really might be dangerous. So a child starts out, maybe as I put on the picture on your canvas, like jumping off a roof is a high-risk activity. But some of the behaviors that the research might look at is smoking, drinking or drugs very early on in life, sexual promiscuity and having many partners, not using protection, having sex, driving a car fast, probably I would consider like cliff diving and bungee jumping. Those would be risk-taking behaviors to me. We also see with antisocial behavior a lot of ADD and ADHD. And so think about how important it is to diagnose these and give proper treatment for these, because both of these behaviors interfere with learning and behavior. So deceitfulness, that lying very early on. And when I'm talking about lying, kids will lie if they fear they're going to be punished. But what we are talking about is lying in things that really don't matter. Like if somebody says, "Oh, I just read this book and it was really good." And we have our kid who lies, "Oh, yeah, I read that." And even though they know nothing about it. I've had inmates do that where they lie and they said, "Well, I can get a job because I'm a welder." And when you start asking them questions, like where did you go to a tech center to learn how to weld? They'll avoid those questions because they're just trying to give an answer you want to hear to get them off their back. But we see that pattern of lying. And one of the things antisocial people are very good at is manipulating. And so a lot of times, particularly in criminal justice, we'll have inmates that'll say what they think we want to hear. One of the ones that you'll hear people say is, "Well, I'm very remorseful for my crime." Because that almost becomes a standard that the courts expect people to feel bad about what they did towards the victim. So if you're antisocial, you're not going to feel bad about the victim, but you'll manipulate people. "Oh, gee, it bothers me all the time," even though it doesn't. And that's part of that manipulativeness. We see antisocial behavior is very irresponsible. And think about it, school-wise, job-wise, friendship-wise. One of the things that irresponsibility leads to is the inability to form opportunities over time. So one of the things you can always tell somebody that's antisocial has a lot, they might go and work, but they don't last long at the jobs. And usually if you ask them, they'll say that they, excuse me just a minute. Sorry about that. I'm recording this at work and had a student come to my office. Anyways, the last characteristic is callousness or unemotional. This is where we see a lot with offenders where they lack empathy, they lack guilt for their act, or how they use others. And so this is one of the things that most of us, if we did something to hurt somebody, it would really bother us. And what it separates antisocial behavior is that their interaction with others a lot of times doesn't have any effect on them. And a lot of times they reword how it is. I've heard, like, "Oh, well, if people go to work and have a job, they're just suckers. I'm not a sucker." Or if somebody gets taken or they take advantage of somebody, let's say you leave your car unlocked and they get in and take everything. Well, you're at fault because you didn't lock your doors. So they really have a lot of excuses built into that. And some of you read about Sykes and Mott's last session, Under Control Theories. And this is the ability of people to go in and out of crime is because they come up with rationalizations. And being antisocial doesn't change those rationalizations. So some of the continuity, some of the things that help behaviors continue over time could be the environment, such as community. We've read a lot about poverty. If all you're exposed to are negativity and pro-criminal activities, one of the things that research shows is in poorer neighborhoods, criminals gather more. They're more densely located there. There might be genetic reasons and how the expression of genes comes out. What we inherit is not behavior, but it does present a predisposition or a tendency to behave in certain ways. So if your gene makeup is hyperactivity, for example, then you have a predisposition to be hyperactive. And so, can we change that behavior? Yes, but there has to be a lot of positive interaction from all different areas, such as the family. Family is a source of continuity, and we've seen, like with low self control, ineffective parenting. And why didn't it switch? Finally, biological, these neuropsychological deficits. We've learned about different parts of the brain that might not form correctly, or there could be brain damage. Autonomic irregularities, such as like low resting heart rate, that you don't get flustered where most people do. Temperamental traits that we talked about. And finally, your social environment. You get rejected by peers, so you hang around peers that, birds of a feather might flock together because there's no one else flocking with them. But you're still a bird. You don't need to be with the flock. And so it might be that deviant behavior or antisocial people, the only ones that they can get along with are other antisocial behavior. And neighborhood disorganization and family dysfunction adds to that because there's really no boundaries of behavior. And so that is a little presentation about the life course.